Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to The Open Door. Jim Hanink here, along with co-host Mario Ramos-Reyes. Our good friend Christopher Zehnder joins us. This week, our podcast will explore the broad situation of the transgender person. We have a number of questions that we want to discuss, but we always begin in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you will renew the face of the earth. Lord, by the light of the Holy Spirit, you have taught the hearts of your faithful. In the same Spirit, help us to relish what is right and always rejoice in your consolation. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
We should start with the fundamental concepts and, even more importantly, the fundamental realities which those concepts seek to take hold. What's the difference? How are we to understand the difference between sex and gender? What do you think? Maybe we should start with Mario because he's older and might be wiser. We'll see. We'll see.
Neither. But, it's an interesting question. Perhaps we need to make a story before this idea came into the mainstream in the 1970s. But the idea of that male and female were distinguished by biology was an old idea, a traditional idea. And so the physical dimension, the biological dimension was relevant then. So if we begin broadly with this anthropology, we may say that the distinction between gender and sex came in the 1970s. And probably we may refer to 1971, 73, 72, when Kathy Millett talked about the idea of patriarchal society. And so in some ways, the theory or the claim of Marx came into blending this idea that some people were dominated, some people were those who dominate others. And so the identification between these two sexes were transformed into some cultural roles. In other words, what make an individual, male or female, was not as much as biology rather than culture. And culture was based upon this domination of one class over the other. And so from there on, then the gender theory began to be refined and advanced in different dimensions. And all of them, of course, brought about by some, at least, more radical idea about feminism. So I think we need to begin from there. So the role of culture and the abandonment of the idea of biology as a determining factor in calling someone male or female.
All right. So there is a Marxist overlay to this differentiation between sex and gender. Perhaps there are other approaches to it as well. Christopher, what would you say?
This is interesting. This is a question I was just recently thinking about, because if you come from a Thomistic background, where do you place sex? It's not essence. It's not the essence of something, right? Male and female have the same essence, the same nature. So we're both rational animals. It's not a mere accident, I don't think. It's like skin color is an accident. It's sort of more like what Thomas would call a property, rather like risibility, or the ability to see humor, right? Because we're rational, we can see humor, and it's a necessary result.
Now, just a minute. What's this risibility stuff?
Well, we were engaging in it before the show.
I'm not sure everybody is in tune with risibility. Tell us about
the ability to laugh
just
at
as a sidebar, right? Christopher. What is this risibility, and what does it do with hilaritas and the drinking to ad hilaritatem?
Well, it's all kind of... Well, risibility is a bit different from hilaritas, I would think. Risibility is the ability to see the humorous. Hilaritas is generally where you make yourself humorous.
So there's nothing humorous about laughing hyenas.
No, but they're not engaged in risibility either.
Right.
Anyway,
all right.
These sides, Jim.
Okay. Gentle listeners, we have asides, and we've just had one. We go forth, marching, shoulder to shoulder.
Anyway, so where do you place sex? Is it? I would think you'd place it as a property. The weird thing about it is that risibility, I know you like that word, is common to both men and women. But in some ways, we can't say sex is common. Both men and women have sex, but they have different sexes. So how, if being a father is a property of being human, you would expect you'd have two. So it seems like it's very different. It's kind of a property that's also a relation, a complementarity between the two major divisions of the human species. And it's a complementarity, and as a complementarity, there's always difference, right? And that difference is rooted ultimately in what's you might say is animal in us, the necessity to reproduce the species. And so at the very basis of sex is those, as Mario was talking about, those physical differences, which make it possible for us to reproduce the species. So from that, I would think, would arise any other differences that we notice between men and women. Obviously, certain physical differences, like women have breasts, so they can, and men don't. But also differences maybe of character, not necessarily character is a bad word, but certain gifts, certain proclivities, and the like, which generally speaking, make women differ from men. And so that second thing, gender, is I mean, we Latin language wags like to say there are only three genders, right? Masculine, feminine, neuter. But the word gender, I think what people are trying to get at is something which is derived from the sexual differences, and that those things which are derived, those differences that we notice between men and women, which are not merely rooted in the body, are interchangeable between different men and women. It doesn't. You can have a biological sex, but you can have the opposite gender, or a gender which is neither one or the other.
Could we say something like this? We have long supposed that gender is very close to sex and follows sex, as it were. But for various reasons, of late, gender has come to be more and more disassociated from sex, and for some, to the point that sex is now something that follows gender rather than the reverse. We think of gender in contemporary terms in a psychological, sociological way, and given medical technology, biological sex is malleable, and so our gender preferences, some say, should really, all things being equal and technology being accessible, our gender preferences are in a place to reshape the biological given. And in some cases, they ought to, especially when there's a sense of dissonance on the part of the individual between the biological dimension and the psychological, sociological dimension. That seems to me to be a dynamic at work.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, well.
Now, what the people... I'm sorry, Mario, please, yes.
Well, yes, the word gender, at least what I read, referred to more the psychological aspect and the cultural aspect of the individual. And in that sense, one become what we wanted to be through our own history, our own education. And so in other words, we build our own gender, and we are affected by different factors of our own situation. In other words, we are not born with a fixed biology and sex. We determine who we are rather than we become. And we become through, again, certain particular situation of the individual. And if we claim that we are intransferable and we are unique, then we decide who we are. I think this cultural aspect took a very important role in philosophy beginning in the 19th century. And I remember a very famous quote from Ortega y Gasset, the Spanish philosopher, who said, well, when you observe an orchestra, you may say that the violinist is using a chord, and that chord and that instrument come from wood and from a particular, animal, and that's nature. But the melody is culture. And so the art that he's producing is cultural. And so when you are listening to this orchestra, this symphony, you don't listen to what is natural there rather than what is cultural. And so it seems that contemporary anthropology focuses more on what is cultural, and somehow what is natural, so to speak, is underneath and can be molded according to the circumstances.
That's an interesting comparison, that's for sure. Well, let me mention at this point and honor her as I mention her, Sister Mary Prudence Allen, who's written a 3-volume account of the concept of woman. One of the themes that Sister Prudence wants to put forward and develop is, while acknowledging that there is a kind of legitimacy in using gender in a broader cultural and psychological way than one might use biological sex, while acknowledging that if we think about the conceptual development, if we try to map conceptually the very concept of gender, well, we can't help but think of Genesis, book of Genesis, the book of beginnings, of coming to be, and of course the coming to be by way of God's creative action. And were we to move to the New Testament, one of the things we find, it's in Matthew, isn't it? When we speak about the coming of Jesus Christ, Logos, the eternal Word, we prepare the way for that coming by looking at the generations that led to Christ, the generations. And those generations are marked out biologically. And then maybe, and if we're into philosophy, we're likely to do this, we could look at how our language, our English language, works. And Sister Prudence Allen has a nice listing here of cognate terms for gender. And I'm just going to read this, half of a paragraph. She says that such a listing would include a whole family of terms with the root gen, as in gender. And what's this list? Genealogy, generate, generous, genesis, genetic, gene, genial, genital, genitive, genius, genocide, gens, gentleman, gentlewoman, genuine, and the suffix geni, as in progeny. And what she's doing there is to say that we can, depending on the context, make a distinction between sex and gender, but when gender loses its roots in sex, its biological roots, it becomes a kind of a cultural artifact to toss about, and it's really untethered. Does that seem like a good point that she's making?
I think it is. The problem is that the body is now seen, as you pointed out before, as a cultural artifact. We can manipulate it at will. It has really no character of its own that we need to respect. So, if that's the case, then the will merely becomes the arbiter of what expression, not only the expression, but the very structure of the body. I think that's where we're at now.
If the body has become itself intrinsically formless, then it's too the artifact of the culture.
Right. Yeah. And so what it is. The body is kind of a biological accident of evolution. And so, why should one be bound to a biological accident?
Now, Sister Prudence wants to connect her effort to, she calls it, ransom gender from its current plight as a concept. We might call it retrieve gender. She wants to do so from a Thomistic perspective, with a Thomistic perception based on a Thomistic perspective. Get our P's and our Q's in order. And she has a very telling passage from St. Thomas in the Summa Contra Gentiles. She says, and these are his words, not hers, quote from the Common Doctor, diversity, nevertheless, does not result from a diversity in the essential principles of the soul itself, nor from otherness in respect of the intelligible essence of the soul, but from diversity in the commensuration of souls to bodies. Since this soul is adapted to this and not that body, and that soul to another body, and so in all instances. Now, it is as forms that souls have to be adapted to bodies. I think that's not a well-known passage from Thomas, so I'm going to read it one more time. Diversity. A lot of people think of that as a very, very contemporary term, and only contemporary. Well, here's Aquinas talking about diversity in the 1200s. Diversity, nevertheless, does not result from a diversity in the essential principles of the soul itself. Our shared dignity comes from our having a soul directly infused by God. Does not result from a diversity in the essential principles of the soul itself, nor from otherness, the other. We are talking more and more about the other, nor from otherness in respect of the intelligible essence of the soul, but from diversity in the commensuration of souls to bodies. This soul is fitted to this body. Since this soul is adapted to this and not to that body, and that soul to another body, and so in all other instances. Now it is as forms that souls have to be adapted to bodies. So the soul is the form of the body. There is a distinctive human soul, but souls are individuated by way of the matter of the body and not just any matter. And that, I think, underscores this idea that we can't distinguish between gender and sex in such a way as to suppose that the coming to be in each of every one of us involves a body-soul composite, and that the soul is not indifferent with respect to the body. It is commensurated to this body rather than that body. And I don't want to launch off into the theological deeps at this point, but when we speak at the other end, not our coming to be, but our continuing to be in eternity, the resurrection of the body is the resurrection of a particular body, not a generic body. And there's all sorts of philosophical issues there, but it's in keeping with this idea, fundamental idea of body-soul unity, and the soul isn't unified with just any body, but with a particular body. Now, I think all of that speaks to the unity of the human person and speaks against this idea that we are simply cultural artifacts.
Mm-hmm. I guess a simple way of putting it is to say the body matters.
Yes.
And
yes.
No pun intended.
No, you wouldn't do that. Not in the middle of philosophical and theological reflections. Unless, of course, you were getting back to your theme of risibility.
Well, I you're the one that brought up risibility as a side. Anyway.
All of that said, and left on the table to think about, which is the way it always works with philosophy and theology, we have, as a phenomenon, here and now, a great increase in the number of transgender persons. And one of the things we have to figure out is just how to identify a transgender person. And we also have to try to figure out, as best we can, why there are so many more self-designated transgender persons than in the past. Mario, any thoughts on those questions?
The question, I don't know if I understood well the question.
We could start with you walk into a room. How do you know who's transgender and who's not? And if you walk into a room and it turns out that there are a lot of transgender persons present, and you start to think to yourself, gee, this is surprising. Why is it that there are now a considerable number of self-designated transgender persons?
So the question I think if I interpret well, is why is that we have too many people today who claim to be transgender?
Yes, and since maybe we're not sure about their claims, how would we ascertain the validity of the claim?
Well, I would start with the first part of the question, and I think there's a positive opinion, if you will, of our own culture. We live in an environment where freedom is paramount, and people express whatever they feel they are. So if we begin from there is a positive aspect to it. In other words, when people allow themselves to do whatever they want, even though I may disagree with them, even though I may not agree with the notion that how they define freedom. But the starting point has to, they try to express themselves as they are or they claim to be. That, I think, is a positive step, instead of a society which is completely closed, where people show an aspect of themselves that they are not. So in that sense, we may say, well, I'm surprised that this is happening now. But then I can turn around that expression and say, well, that's show that society, at least in that sense, is more open than previous time. I would start with this reflection.
So society has made progress, and society has also lost ground, but it's a positive thing to recognize deeply felt individual concerns. And insofar as that's the case, the increase of self-designated transgender persons is okay. It's understandable because it is an effect, a side effect, if you will, of an increased and rightful social freedom.
I would say yes. Say yes.
As far as it goes.
And that, right, and that's perhaps can lead us to a reflection about how then we begin reflecting on our society and which one should be our political regime, a regime which can channel these differences of expression of freedom or not. How then we deal with that, how then we accommodate these people. That may lead to us to the topic, the issue of religious freedom, etc., etc. So that is my point. And so perhaps if we begin with defining freedom from the beginning, then we may run into certain difficulties there. But my point is that we observe and see, well, this is what's happening now, at least from the starting point. That may be something that we can use in order to build a more a pluralistic society, which establish religious freedom and everything along these lines.
All right, so the social manifestation of individual freedom gives rise to all sorts of phenomena, but one of the phenomena that it can give rise to is political initiative and to philosophical initiative as well. Christopher, what would you say?
Well, I'm not sure if I understand the point entirely. So, I mean, I do have a difficulty in seeing freedom as that for which society exists, to maximize individual freedom. I think freedom is a negative freedom. I think is been understood here, not the positive freedom, say, whereby I have the ability to walk, right? But I'm allowed to walk by somebody else. Negative freedom is good to a certain extent, but it in of itself can't be the goal of society, because it's essentially a negative. It's hard for me to see that itself is something to strive for. It's rather an instrumental good, and it has to be limited in any society by the demands of the common good. I mean, I might find that my individual expression at a certain point means that I don't want to stay with my wife, or I want to be a bigamist, or something of that sort.
Go Gan.
Should that be tolerated and allowed? I don't think so.
First you went to Ohio, and next it's Tahiti.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because
Your wife could put up with Ohio, but not Tahiti.
Part of it is
that the positive freedom come into play in this fashion. When a significant number of people exercising their negative freedom decide to, say, redeclare their sexual identity, then a positive freedom would come into play when they have a certain amount of social support for doing so. Hence, we have a good many laws now that provide legal support, political support, social recognition for transgender persons.
Mm-hmm. Which only extends the error in society that this is somehow an expression which is
of course, what we need to do is identify what the error is. I think Sister Prudence Allen, of course, would say there's a deep error at the level of philosophical anthropology, and that it's destructive of the unity of the human person. The transgenderization of the person is destructive of a fundamental unity. There are some other, I guess you could call them, epistemological questions here. Suppose somebody says, you're I don't know where, you're going to some social group that you attend. Suppose somebody says, I've decided that I'm really transgender. And you look at them and they look exactly like they've looked every time you see them, recently at any rate. If a person says I'm transgender, does that make them transgender, or could we say the only way to identify a transgender person is when the person has undergone what's termed transition, which involves physical intervention at various levels, or is obviously into transition even if the transition hasn't been completed? Do we have to have biological markers in order to really identify whether somebody is a transgender person or not?
Well, I mean, if you look at much of what goes in the discourse nowadays, no biological markers are necessary. In fact, there's even been talk. I remember Oberlin here in Ohio a few years ago had a conference where they were discussing whether one could change one's gender by the day, perhaps even by the hour, and that's considered to be perfectly acceptable. That I'm going to be I feel like I'm a male today, but tomorrow I'll be a female, and I could be something else the following day. Since genders become, after a certain point, almost infinite, it seems. So, I don't think, according to the way things are thought, in other words, according to I think the prevailing idea is, I'm the one who determines what I am, and I determine the expression of that. And and society has nothing to say about it. Except it has to respect me, respect my decisions, respect my feelings.
What about, we only occasionally hear this concept, what about somebody who says, I'm transracial?
Well, that did happen. What's that? NAACP, was she the president or something, some high-ranking thing? Turned out she was not black, and she was claiming to be black, and it was a big uproar about that. She could not understand the black.
Didn't the person in question say, well, I'm transracial?
Right, exactly.
Was she?
Was she?
Yes.
No.
No.
I mean, she could have been. I mean, I could say this. She could have been raised
biologically black.
She wasn't biologically. I mean, she could have been raised in black culture. I don't know if she was, but I can see that. Like if a West African were raised in Germany and adopted German culture to that extent, they would be. I guess you could consider them German, but you wouldn't consider them racially German.
What would you think about this? Suppose we're looking at a Native American group, and we do some anthropology, and it turns out that in this Native American group, from time to time, someone will radically identify with the eagle and come to refer to himself or herself as an eagle. And suppose in the particular grouping, there's a certain respect afforded to the person who takes on the persona of the great eagle.
Well, I don't know if that's quite the same thing, because I think the eagle there is not necessarily eagle as we think of it, but more of a spirit. So there's a kind of guardian spirit that could be considered to be the eagle. So I'm not sure that's the same thing.
Although the person might have a paraphernalia that made him look like an eagle in certain regards. Well, let me muddy the water a little bit more. There are a number of people who undergo what's called detransition. They take themselves to be transgender persons. They have a certain amount of medical intervention, and then they decide that, in fact, they want to return to the status quo ante, and they undergo more medical interventions, and then they, at a certain point, say that they've detransitioned. What about that? Were they once transgender and now not transgender?
Well, when the question has to be the self-designation of transgender, does that even have to meet with is that real? Or is it simply a matter of just maybe self-deception? If it's the latter, then they never were. I mean, they never were transgender. They were males or females with a certain idea of themselves.
So the reason for saying that it was a matter of confusion, sexual confusion, the reason for saying that is, our underlying reason for saying that would be, you really can't change your biological sex. You can be unhappy with it. You can want to change its cultural and social manifestations, but you really can't do that anyway.
Right, yeah. So, if I can interject something there.
Yes, please do.
So the question is then, why in this realities are happening in our society.
Why do so many people claim that this is the case?
Well, yes, it's the case, but the question is why then this is happening.
Yeah.
It is because there is an underlying philosophy or worldview or how people perceive reality, or there is something else. That's the question. I think that's a legitimate question. And another question is, given the fact that this is happening today, how then we have to approach that? How then we need to deal with that or confront that or engage in a dialogue with that? I think this is another question.
Now, one of our party members from not Tahiti, but Ohio, Shane Ian Hoffman, has raised the following point. He says that if we're trying to figure out why the increase in transgenderism, he has two suggestions. And one is a bit like Mario's first point. He says more people are willing to speak openly. But then he says, second point, I think the fact that traditional marriage and gender roles don't seem to be providing lasting results. See divorce and abuse rates, and are getting worse and worse. People, especially young ones, are increasingly speculating in these areas as they search for something permanent. I'm not attempting, he says, to answer a nature versus nurture question here, just a possible avenue for some unknown percentage of people. So if we have a stable gender roles that emerge from marriage, except marriages don't work, then maybe we ought to explore what we thought were stable gender roles and maybe take drastic alternatives. Could that be the case?
I think so. I think that's it's what we used to call scandal. Young people have seen just how marriage has failed, and that does, I think, lead to questions. There are other things probably involved in it too, just personal proclivities and that type of thing. But I think that is sound.
What about other sources of identity confusion, such as I don't know who I am in a kind of technocratic society. I don't know who I am in the context of a hugely urban society. I don't know who I am in the context of waves and waves of immigration. I don't know who I am in the context of kind of a collapse of any meaningful political role for the individual. If we have any number of threats to the person's identity, then in a struggle to gain identity, transgenderism might be attractive to some people.
Mm-hmm. I think that's true. I think that's true with men. I think we often talk about women's issues and how we have to address women's issues, but what we don't address oftentimes are male issues. There is a real sense amongst, I think, young men where they don't know what their place is anymore in society, what's their purpose anymore. And part of that's because we've leveled everything down to a kind of soup, a sexual soup, between sexual role soup, I probably should put. I think there is, and so it becomes a matter of choice at that point.
If we have people struggling, as we do, and they're struggling with questions of sexual identity and the social and psychological expressions of sexual identity, it could well be that they want to get counsel. They want to talk about this. And something is much discussed today, conversion therapy. We even have now laws against conversion therapy. How should we understand conversion therapy?
Well, back in the day when I was in journalism, I did some articles on the National Organization for the Recovery of, I forget, NARTH, it was called. I can't remember what it stands for anymore. And that was one of their claims, is that they could, maybe I was told by the head of NARTH that we can counsel these people, homosexual males in particular, and they just get a 1/3 recovery rate. They recover their natural identity as males, and they recover from homosexuality. There are other forms of conversion therapy, I understand, which use like electric shock treatment and things of that sort, which I think is probably cruel. But I don't really know enough about personally the claims on either side to make a claim to say whether the claims of NARTH were true or not. But
I guess one of the problems is simply defining what conversion therapy is. I suppose somebody who's struggling with questions of sexual identity could speak to her or his spiritual director and be counseled to think about the nature of sexuality, to think about the Christian tradition with regard to sexuality, and to pray about it. And some might say, well, that all amounts to a challenge to the person who's presenting with homosexual attractions. And as such, since it's a challenge, it should count as a kind of conversion therapy, but there would seem to be light years between that and electric shock.
Exactly, right. And I think it's important. I think it's important to at least acknowledge that there are cases, and maybe all cases of homosexuality, I don't know, where maybe it is somewhat. It's not something that they choose. It's something that is expressed in time from something, confusion, even in the genetic structure. I don't know. I wouldn't myself dismiss that, because it does seem that some men and women seem to have these desires for the same sex from a very early, time of puberty at least. And how do you explain that when you could, from the same family, everybody else, all the other children are express it in the natural manner? So, in that sense, I mean, it's not natural in the proper sense of the term natural, but it's natural in the sense that that's the way their body is developed, and that there's some reason within their flesh, their own flesh, that they feel this way.
Well, I think a lot of us, in trying to work through these issues, wish we knew more about biology, and wish we knew more about what sort of treatment for transgender persons is suitable, or whether any treatment is suitable. And so we find ourselves looking for good studies, statistical studies. So what would make for a good statistical study of transgender persons? I mean, from time to time, and it's more often than not of late, there's a headline that will say, "This study shows that." What makes for a good statistical study? And what about the very recent claim that, say what you want about transgenderism or transgender persons, which is much better than transgenderism, say what you want, surgical intervention, even highly invasive surgical intervention, can reduce the suicide rate for transgender people.
Well, I'm not sure I know enough about the whole subject to comment on it. It would be a good statistical study.
Were you to start to look around, what would you look for? Probably studies that involve a large sample, right?
Right, exactly.
Probably studies that are longitudinal, that carry out their investigation over a long period of time. Probably somebody who really knows how to analyze statistics, right? Mm-hmm. Now, there's a recent piece by a sociologist from the University of Texas, whose name I don't often hear. Maybe I've never heard it. I've seen it often enough, and I don't know how really he would pronounce it, so I'll just pretend that I know. Ramos-Reyes. And he did a piece on public discourse not so long ago, talking about what he thought was qualitatively a superb study. A study involving 97% of the population of Sweden, and it was a long-term study, and I'm sure it didn't study just the situation of the transgender person, but it did very explicitly include that. And when the discussion of this study went public, it was presented as, say what you want, surgical intervention reduces the rate of suicide for transgender people. So we read this, right? How do we respond to it? Well, Ramos would say that if you know anything about good studies, you know that statistically speaking, in terms of size of sample, length, level of mathematical analysis, you couldn't ask for more. But then what he says is, if you are in a position to read through carefully all of this material, you wouldn't come up with a headline that says this is something that's necessary to prevent suicide. The way he interprets the study, and he got down to very particular things, the study suggests that one would need 49 surgical interventions in order to establish the probability of having one fewer transgender persons seeking mental health care. And he says this is not some sort of ringing affirmation. This is anything but that. And so whenever we have a study that says such and such, we can't leave out that you have to interpret the results of the study. And if the interpretation of the results of the study is left to people that already have a prior agenda, we shouldn't hold our breath in hoping for a decent interpretation. Now, one of the things that says to me is, in order to be informed, you got to do your homework and you got to ultimately think. You can't just process what you see in the newspaper. And speaking as a philosopher, one of the background things I'd want to say at this point is when you read statistical studies, you have to have some, at least some, understanding of causality. Now, I think we all know that correlation isn't the same as causality. If there's a correlation between A and B, it doesn't follow that A causes B. And we all know that after-the-fact analysis doesn't work. It's not the case that if something happened after something else, that which was prior caused the thing to happen, which was not. But when we moved from the physical sciences think of chemistry and biology and physics. When we move from the physical sciences to the social sciences, and social sciences necessarily include, the word would be the behavior of human beings, but we're not interested in twitches and coughs, so we need something better than behavior. Social sciences involve the actions of human beings. Well, then we have to understand that we're not dealing with causality as in the physical sciences. We're dealing with a different kind of causality altogether. I think it would be a very mixed kind of causality. We might be interested in certain human actions, but the variable background would be enormously shifting. And all of that has to be taken into account. And certainly, if we want to continue to speak about causality in the social sciences, we can't be talking about, I think, terms like causal necessity or causally determined. I think the notion of any kind of behavioral determinism just drops out altogether. But good grief, that takes us back to one of our ongoing themes, the need for serious education if we're going to be citizens that have a sense of what the common good is and how we might advance the common good. Or so it seems to me. We're down pretty close to the end of our hour. I wonder if either of you gentlemen would like to make some final observations.
Well, I think the whole issue lead us to a reflection about what type of dialogue we need to engage in order to talk about with people with this situation in the public square. I think that is precisely the crux of the matter of contemporary liberal democracy. And I think that is what people, some intellectuals are concerned, to what extent we can really discuss this issue openly, how then we go about and interpret this, if you call this studied objectively. And so ultimately, again, it's a political issue.
And sometimes it takes courage to speak up about these sorts of questions.
Yeah, I think Mario's right about that, is that we have to, how do we speak about it? The problem is that we're often not allowed to speak about it in terms of the fact, I mean, we can say things. You're going to have to face a tremendous amount of social ostracism and often just irrational condemnation for even bringing up such subjects.
Especially at a Golden Globes award ceremony.
Yeah.
Well, we're here for the long haul, are we not, gentlemen?
We're not in it for the flowers.
Yes.
I've told the story before, but there was this little shtetl, Central Europe, afraid that they might miss the Messiah. So the elders appointed 3 or 4 young fellows to go to the very farthest reaches of the land connected with the little shtetl to be on the alert for the Messiah. And if he were to come, then they should run back and announce it to the village. Well, what happened is they didn't run back, but about a year later they came back and said, look, the wages are low. The wages are low. We want a raise. The village elder said, well, we take your point, and they went to consult, and they came back after an hour or so, and they told these young fellows who were already a year older, you betcha the wages are low, but the work is steady. The work is steady. And so we've got steady work. All right. We end with today's gospel, this from Luke. It happened that there was a man full of leprosy in one of the towns where Jesus was. And when he saw Jesus, he fell prostrate, pleaded with him, and said, "Lord, if you wish, you can make me clean." Jesus stretched out his hand, touched him, and said, "I do will it. Be made clean." And the leprosy left him immediately. Then he ordered him not to tell anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses prescribed. That will be proof for them. The report about him spread all the more, and great crowds assembled to listen to him and to be cured of their ailments. But he would withdraw to deserted places to pray. The Gospel of the Lord. Come, Lord Jesus, come. Thank you very much. Next week we have Bishop Strickland. I'll be in touch.
Okay.
Bye.
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 Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.